Well, we're good to go then.
Joe said both of us look fine to him, so there we go. Shit. Okie dokie
Awesome.
then. Works for me. As long as it's good on their end, we'll figure it out here. Got your famous Corona?
I do. I got 2 on standby.
There you go. I should have gotten an alcoholic beverage. I've been drinking myself into a stupor the last 2 nights, so it's like maybe drinking during the stream is not a great idea for me.
Yeah, oh, what the hell is that?
All right. Well,
yeah.
Let's see. Let's get things rolling. Hey guys, welcome to the 42nd episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comics community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations, we pretty much hit it all. This week, of course, I am rejoined by the man, the myth, the legend, the Canadian Cape Crusader, my pal, ComicBoom. Brother, it's good to have you on, as always.
Good to be here again, Dark Knight. Good to be here again.
All right. Well, with all the formalities out of the way, obviously you guys can look at the thumbnail and piece together what we're going to be talking about today. And it's kind of the contesting trains of thought of creativity versus continuity. Big 2 publishers in particular, with these massively sprawling multiverses with 80 years-ish of continuity, have a lot to manage. And the question always arises as to whether or not it is worth compromising continuity for the creativity of the story, and vice versa. Do we have an overwhelming responsibility to maintaining the continuity versus giving a creator the creativity and the option to tell the story that they want to tell? It is a big question, and you'll find people in both camps. There are, I think, a lot of older fans that will prioritize continuity over everything, regardless. My Batman is my Batman, my Spider-Man is my Spider-Man, and that's it. And then you do have, I think, more in the younger base of fans that are like, well, I just want a good story. I don't care what you do with the characters. And, I think my approach to it personally is pretty uninteresting in that, like most things, I think it's a compromise. I think that obviously you have to take everything in moderation and gauge the circumstance specifically. But Boom, you've obviously been reading comics for, longer than I've been alive, not to date you too far, but you might have a very specific hot button view on this. So if you're looking at the idea of creativity versus continuity, what is your inherent reaction?
Well, my opinion is that if you're a really good writer, it doesn't matter if you need to it doesn't matter if you have a character like Superman that has a lot of continuity, or if you're writing a new character. It's more challenging if you have an established character. And that to me is the added test of a good writer. A good writer can tell a creative story. A great writer can tell that same story after being told what the history is of the character they're writing about and fit it in. It is an extra, I believe it's an extra gift. It's an extra art, and it's an extra scripting ability to be able to take a great idea and to fit it into an existing continuity. Look, we all know if you're writing an image title for the first time and it's your own work, you don't have to worry about continuity. You can do what you want. But the moment you establish that initial story and it resonates with readers, you've already established history of the character, you've established characterization, you've established an environment, you've established certain worldviews, you've established characterizations of antagonists, protagonists, supporting characters, so that the next person that comes along that writes a story subsequent to yours, if they're not some way respectful of that before they change things, things have to be justified. And no story starts in a vacuum, especially when you're dealing with these characters which are as Spike Valentine calls them, creatures of our folklore. We have to, writers have an obligation to be respectful of them, and it's a very, very, very difficult thing to bridge out on your own and to deviate from continuity. A few writers can pull it off, but very few can. And I'm thinking like the Grant Morrisons, and maybe even a little bit of Scott Snyder's, and maybe even some Jeff Johns, and then you get the ones that fail utterly, like the Bendises, that just they just like to watch the past stories burn, and they just burn everything down, and they think that they blame it on the readers if we don't get their story.
Yeah,
I don't know. What do you think?
So for me, I largely think that if you're working in the big two and you're working in mainline continuity, it is your responsibility as a competent writer to adhere to the history of the character. You know what you're getting into. And this was the argument that, obviously I've gained a lot more subscribers from when we first started having this conversation over a year ago, almost 2 years ago. You know what you're getting into, right? Like, this is what people want. If we wanted a story where you tell your Batman or your Superman that inherently contradicts what we already know the character to be, go do it in Elseworlds. Go make an image book to do whatever. But there is a duty that you have as a writer to be both creative and engage with the continuity. It's point blank. It's basically in the job description, right? Like, I'm not going to be an accountant and not know how to use Microsoft Excel. That'd be heretical. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So in that same way, I think a competent writer is able to balance the two. I don't think it has to be creativity versus continuity. And that's why I think the most widely beloved comic book writers are the ones that are able to do just that. I mean, we've talked in recent weeks, especially about Grant Morrison. And the thing that I think that we can at least mutually understand is a huge benefit to his involvement in the comic book industry is he loves continuity. And he is so creative that he's able to update continuity that no longer really matches current standards, that might be outdated. And he's able to give it a spin that makes it feel relevant. You know what I mean? And I brought this up before. Batman Rest in Peace. I mean, what he did with Batman Zur-En-Arrh and Batmite was genius. What he did with the original Kate Kane was genius. He took pre-existing continuity that was silly, a little bit juvenile and goofy, and gave it some real footing. And then, we could sit here for an hour and talk about what Jeff Johns did with Green Lantern. But, it seems like we tend to, or as of this argument, we have some very similar feelings on it. And I'm curious for you, what happens when you have a writer who is able to affect the continuity in a major way, but what they've done is a detriment to the overall continuity of the characters in the universe. Are you willing to compromise your value and cut it out from existence? Or do you feel like it is the responsibility of the comic book company to retcon it and find a way to manipulate it, either give it credence or do something that's within the tools of the genre to maybe manipulate it to have it make sense? How do you feel about that? Are you Ned Stark? Will you not compromise, or are you willing to do what needs to be done?
I actually will compromise straight up. I think it's beholden to us as readers to allow and to recognize and acknowledge how difficult a job probably running DC and Marvel comics is. Just to be clear here, if I respect, like, for example, take Marvel One More Day, or when they removed Peter Parker and Mary Jane's marriage, I was against that, but I respected Marvel for what they did. They said, "Look, we don't like it. We're getting rid of it. We're not going to have too big an event. We're just going to have Mephisto, wish it away. We're going to have the devil involved. It's going to be it's going to be 4 issues long, and then we're just going to undo it, and then we're going to move along." And is there going to be hiccups? Yeah, there are. Just deal with it. We trust you, the readers, to make it work in your heads. there's something about that I respected Marvel. They didn't spend a big campaign trying to, apologize for it and everything else. They knew it would wrinkle some feathers. It did, or ruffle some feathers. They didn't care. They just did it. And look, it can be messy, but this goes to my central point. You made a point earlier that I thought was really good about when writers, when they do their own thing, even if they're very successful and they have a story that resonates, it might not fit in very well to the rest of the continuity. And the problem this creates is what has happened right now at DC. We have Death Metal, we have Doomsday Clock, we have arguably the Snyder's Justice League story, we have the Bendis verse, we got the Wonder Comics, we got these different writers that let's not talk about whether or not we like them all as writers, but let's assume they're all great writers and they're all great stories. The fact is that they don't fit in very well right now. You create different fiefdoms. And so we're very hard on the writers right now, but we should be mindful that if we say to all the writers, look, create great stories, and they all do that, we can't necessarily expect them to be the ones to read all the comics to know that their stories are going to fit. That's what the editors are for. Yeah. I mean, it takes a village, right? I mean, writers are just one part of the creative process. That's what the editors are for, saying, look, Snyder, you've done a great job here. Or Bendis, we like this. Morrison, we like what you're doing with Green Lantern. But this is what's happening overall. These are the conflicts, the nuances that need to be reshaped. I mean, there should be a continuity editor. And I refuse to believe that can be that difficult a job. You have to have somebody, you need a Kevin Feige, so to speak, for the comic book world, for DC to say, guys, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, but, just a little bit of communication would go a long way.
I mean, really, an editor is also supposed to be able to maintain continuity. That's part of the job. And the thing is that the task of being a good comic book editor, like being good at pretty much anything, is very difficult. A comic book editor carries 3 different editorial roles that you would find in separate positions in prose. If you were to look at the big trade paperback publishers that for novels, Penguin, Random House, Scholastic, Macmillan, so on and so forth, they'll have more of a conceptual editor who's usually credited as the main editor. You have a line editor and a copy editor, right? A comic book editor is supposed to fulfill all 3 of those functions on top of maintaining continuity. And we've talked a lot about writers. Editors are the gatekeepers of continuity, right? They are the gatekeepers of our American mythological pantheon. And when you tend to have massive issues with a company, no matter how good the writers are, if you don't have anybody to rein them in, there's only so far you can go. I mean, you can use a number of different examples, where really talented creators, if you don't give them the sandbox they're ready to play in, they'll do what they want. And if you don't rein them in, it's a total detriment to the characters, to the story, to the continuity. I mean, I'm sure we'll be beating up on Heroes in Crisis more and more as this stream goes on, but geez, clearly nobody's paying attention. Clearly nobody's paying attention to, I want to stay as professional as possible, but I am very frustrated with a very few specific editors at DC Comics that exhibit this either misunderstanding of the comic book industry, the characters, and the continuity, or laziness. I couldn't tell you which it is, but it's one of those 2 things. And that's an issue. And this isn't like one of those moments where I'm just angry fanboy screaming at them. From somebody who is at least knowledgeable of the basics of what it means to be an editor in comics, if I can highlight those weaknesses, there's a problem, right? Like if a little league kid playing little league baseball can outbat Derek Jeter, there's a problem. Yeah. It's not how it should work. So, yeah.
And I just, I just want to make a quick aside on to current pop culture. I think that's what's happening with the Snyder cut for Justice League. I think that has to do with creativity versus continuity. I think that the DC movie going audience that likes the DC movies, I think that the strong desire for a Snyder cut is linked to a desire for the continuity. People weren't happy with it. They want to see the Snyder cut because they're hoping it's going to be more beholden to the continuity established with Batman v Superman and with what came before. And I think that that's what happens when you have a big success like Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and say what you will about those. They were successful movies. And the fact is that once you create something, you create continuity. That's just how it works. The moment you bring something into existence, it has a history, it has a feel, and therefore it has continuity. And so when you create something as a sequel to what you've created, you're always dealing with continuity. And to the extent that you fail, people are going to hold you accountable. And I think the Snyder cut, certainly from my desire for the Snyder cut, is I want a more legitimate continuous sequel to the tone and effect that Snyder had created with Batman v Superman, regardless of how I feel about Batman v Superman.
I mean, in that regard, I'll watch it. I already bought HBO Max. Sure, I'm there. And I do like the idea of having one specific vision, because it is very clear that the original film was piecemealed together. I mean, even the fucking filters, how sloppy is that when you go to reshoot and you can't even match the filters? Aside from just tone and inconsistencies with characters. I mean, I don't want to get too far into it. I mean, either way, listen, whatever Zack Snyder does, I still don't think he's going to make a great movie. I don't. Will it be better than what we got? Very possibly. It's at least it'll be one consistent vision, and it'll feel like a single film. But and there's certainly people that are beholden because of continuity. There are some people that like the Zack Snyder gratuitous violence and everybody being fucking angry all the time. Yeah, that exists. That's a thing. And I don't dislike Zack Snyder. I think Man of Steel is a fine movie. Batman v Superman was a huge disappointment, and and to me, the people that are crying for the Snyder cut, all I say is he had his chance. He made 2 movies. Man of Steel was fine. Batman v Superman was not. Batman v Superman should have crossed $1 billion in its sleep. The 2 most iconic comic book characters of all time. That movie should have, I mean, geez, man, it should have should have sprinted over the $1 billion line, as far as I'm concerned. So that says something. But I do want to start integrating some of the folks here that are joining us in the chat, and because I see we're starting to load up on some of their opinions, so we'll start fleshing these out here. Joe's Geek Show says, when he's in the room, comic go boom. That's a good slogan. You might wanna meander that on over to your channel, man. That's a good one. Jayla Neely, perfect example of creativity is Peter Tomasi's Superman run and Super Sons. The great thing about those 2 runs, Jalen, is that it is a balance of both creativity and continuity, right? He took advantage of what Dan Jurgens had done in the Lois and Clark series and in Convergence. He knew what continuity he had to play with. I mean, the Superman Reborn arc was all about playing with continuity and making it manageable for Superman. Aside from the fact that you're right, it was very creative, but it was still very true to the character. And that's what makes the run so good, is that you didn't have to compromise one for the other, in my opinion. And to be quite frank with you, prior to reading that run, I had read Superman stories, but I wasn't a Superman fan. And that story was successfully able to make me a Superman fan. I felt connected with the character. It feels like the iconic Superman that we all know and love. And yet Tomasi was creative enough to push the character in a new direction that challenged him in a way that he had never been challenged before. And it's being a dad. And it was unique and it fit. And it's clearly why the reception for that run has been so overwhelmingly positive. I don't know, Boom, what do you think?
Yeah, no, Peter Tomasi's run was really good. And the way that they took the Convergence Superman and Lois Lane, and they slowly, brought that into the mainstream DC universe. And eventually the New 52 Superman he died off. They filtered him out and they worked him in with a little bit of a convoluted storyline, but they did a reasonably good job. And it's definitely very creative. And it's funny that you mentioned Peter, Jalen Neely mentions Peter Tomasi's Superman. The exact opposite of that, of a lack of creativity, is how the storyline where they aged up John Kent, trapping him in a volcano for 7 years with the crime syndicate in Earth 3. That was just a terrible story, as in a vain attempt to try to fit into the new continuity, which is still a work in progress now. Because right now in the current issue of Action Comics, the Kents remember Connor Kent as well as their son, and in Lois Lane, in the pages of Lois Lane issue number 10, Lois Lane remembers her past life as Lois Lane. She appears to remember her other past lives in other universes. So does Renee Montoya. So does Jessica Midnight. So there's something going on right now where DC is trying to fit into editorially, because of the failure of 5G. DC right now is clearly struggling by talking to their different writers to try to get a handle on what their continuity is, and they're hoping that their creativity is going to get them there. And I think for Bendis it's failing, but hopefully Snyder will have better luck with Death Metal.
I mean, not to be pessimist in a somewhat pessimistic climate of the world, but frankly, I don't have faith in either of those two writers right now. I mean, Bendis less so than pretty much anybody else, but the big issue here is that, clearly these comic book companies, these publishers are businesses and they're there to make money. But the one thing that I've always found that is so immediately short-sighted is that they are willing to compromise long-term sales for immediacy, for spikes, right? And somehow the industry still gratifies it. We still gratify number ones. We still gratify 1 in 25 trash can covers or fucking whatever. And it works. We let them get away with it, and that includes me at times. Like, as much as I talk about how I'm not a speculator, if there's a dope ass Gary Frank cover on a book, I'm going to buy it because it's Gary Frank. Although I think that variant covers are largely a little bit less of a gimmick than rebooting your universe every 5 minutes. But the issue is that I think they forget how you can build sales over being consistently good at telling stories. I've used the Sandman example a lot. I've overblown that into infinity and beyond. But truly, Sandman was like, Morpheus was an original character that was DC's number one selling book after a couple of years. And sure, it took some time, but not only were you able to obviously validate us spending our money with great story, and we were satisfied buying that story. By we, I mean the community, because I wasn't reading comics back then. Also, I was I wasn't even a fetus, but to be fair, wow, I'm aging myself. To be fair, though, you look back at the sales numbers and Sandman is one of the best comics of all time. And the quality of that book was able to generate sales over time. So if we're in a world where these characters have already existed for 80 years, why are we not planning for longevity? We know that the iconicism has been keeping this industry afloat, strictly the iconicism of these characters, whether or not we go through entire decades of mediocrity, that's what keeps them afloat. So if you know that will give us the gateway into creating some sort of consistency, why not work on the quality of the books? Because eventually, word of mouth happens. Eventually, people will want to just buy good story, and you will consistently sell better, and you will earn the trust of the retailers and of the consumers. I don't know. I think it's a pretty simple concept. I don't think it's that difficult, and I think that for an industry that's been around for coming up on a century, they have a blatant misunderstanding of their own market. I don't know. Is that just me blowing steam? Boom.
No, it's not. Well, I mean, we're both blowing steam here. I mean, look, as a comic collector, we're like drug addicts. It sort of reminds me. It's sort of like during a I picture the apocalypse, or I picture a dystopian future where the food truck drives down the street and we all run behind it, and then there's somebody on the truck throwing food to us, and we're like desperately trying to catch the water bottles as they're being thrown. That's how it is every Wednesday or Tuesday now, when with the variant covers, we're desperate for new stories, and we don't care how bad the water tastes. We still go out and we buy the stories anyway, and then we go on YouTube and we bitch about them. But I mean, that's just, part of it. I like playing the game a little bit, but let's be blunt. Every now and then we get something that tastes real good and it's really fun to read. And, the best writers are the one that there's a pattern that's established here. And the pattern that most writers take is that they will upset the apple cart, and then at the end of their run, they'll reinstate the status quo. Frank Miller will do that with Daredevil. Born Again. He'll destroy him, then he'll build him up again. You tear down your hero, and then by the time you're done the story, the hero's a hero again, and then the status quo is set, and you're back to normal. I mean, that's sort of like the pattern, and in effect, that's one of the things that makes established character writing, I think, more difficult to please a guy like me, because I've seen it done so many times. It's almost a trope. Every writer wants to make their mark. So the best thing they can do is, how can I destroy the hero? What lesson has this hero not learned yet by another writer before I reinstate the status quo and do it again and again? And it's one of my criticisms of Joshua Williamson. But I think it's also why guys like Joe's Geek Show is more. I think he's more favorable to Joshua Williamson than I am, and that's fair. I just note that with Joshua Williamson, for me, I think why Joshua Williamson gets away with what I consider to be mediocre writing.
I agree.
He gets away with it because almost every story arc what Joshua Williamson does is that he has Barry Allen learn the same lessons, and then he sort of almost restores the status quo at the end of every arc, and then he breaks down Barry Allen again for the next arc, and then reinstates him and then breaks him. It's the same pattern, and if you're not paying a lot of attention to the Flash, you can kind of get the illusion that something's actually of substance occurring when really it's not.
Yeah,
we're gonna have 100 issues of the Flash, and you're gonna be able to count on one hand the evolution of Barry Allen's characters, or the lessons he learned during that run. And again, it sounds like I'm being harsh on Williamson, and I guess I am. I just, to me, I think that if you're going to take a chance, if you're going to reinstate the status quo at the end of your storyline anyway, then why not go big? Why not do something really truly epic instead of playing out the same old tropes? And I know it's a tough thing to do, but my God, if there's no excuses, especially when you get to write your own laws on time travel, and you literally get, Williamson, Snyder, Bendis, Morrison, they all seem to get free reign at DC, because good luck trying to reconcile their storylines with each other. That can't be done. They're trying to do that now, and we're going to see the dog's breakfast that results.
Listen, I agree. There are a lot of issues, and they'll compromise the integrity of the storytelling for business, for short-term business. And DC in particular right now has had a huge issue with saying no to big names. And as much as I really wasn't reading comics during like the Jim Shooter days, the one thing I can always respect about Jim Shooter as an editor is that he didn't care who the fuck you were. If the idea wasn't good, it wasn't going to be published, or at least if he didn't think it had legs, right? Everybody has wrongs. Everybody's fallible. But that's clearly not the issue. Bendis wants to do something, they let Bendis do it. That's a problem. That's a real issue. And at that rate, what is the point of maintaining a continuity when none of it makes any sense? This isn't calculus. This is simple arithmetic. 1 and 1 equal 2. There's no debate. We're not using X, Y, integrals, nothing. It's simple math. let's figure this out, right? If this happened a week ago in Superman and in Action Comics, you want to say Superman was off fucking around with space prostitutes at the same exact time, that's an issue.
Yeah.
At that point, 1 and 1 do not equal 2.
Yeah.
It's 1 minus 1. Actually, in Bendis's case, it's like 1 minus, for the sake of DC, let's go 52. And you're sitting way at the negative end of the hand here. So I don't know. I know that what I'm saying is a little bit reductive, and I know that the job is difficult, but I think that there's usually some type of barometer to get a good gauge as to what kind of effort is being put into these projects, right? Like, the one thing we've said about Dan DiDio, for example, is whether or not we agree with his ideas, he genuinely believed he was putting his best foot forward. And you could at least acknowledge that, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that there is certainly a value to that we're not seeing as frequently in current comics editorial.
Yeah. No, I agree. I want to point out something that Joe's Geek Show, he pointed out on this latest issue of the Flash 754. Quite an astonishing editorial mistake. They actually, I got it showing it here, they actually screwed up the word bubbles. Barry Allen is actually saying these words here, and Reverse Flash is saying these words. So it was quite an astonishing editorial mistake. And again, I realize that we're in pandemic times, and we all, I guess they got better things to worry about than probably a word balloon on a comic book. And so, you can let that go, I guess. But it's a little annoying thing. It's, and I guess, are we being anal? Maybe, but it's little things like that, and to me that goes. Now, obviously, that's an editorial mistake. It's not necessarily creativity versus continuity, but it just goes to show that we can't always blame the writers for some of this stuff, because the writers, I'm sure Joshua Williamson made it clear on the page who was what, but obviously the artist is not familiar enough with Reverse Flash and Flash to know that the one should have been painted yellow and the other one red.
You mean like that time Wally West was in Man of Steel as the Flash?
Yes.
And I get what you're going with here, is whether or not you want to say this simple kind of copy editing mistake was in and of itself simple. It also articulates, well, if we can't trust you to maintain these very simple copy editing kind of status quos, right, of quality, how can we expect you to maintain a continuity? How can we expect you to be able to purify what the creators are trying to do conceptually and generate the best story if you can't figure out what word balloons are going where? And again, everybody makes mistakes. It happens. I totally get it. But the main issue here is, generally speaking, we're not seeing, and I know we're going off on DC right now in particular, we're not seeing any consistency in editorial. We're seeing continuity mistakes. We're seeing conceptual mistakes. The number one job of an editor is to purify the creator's vision and turn it into the strongest story possible.
Just think about this. Think about this, Dark Knight. We were in New York. We were at New York Comic Con, October 2019, last year. Had a great time. But we're at the DC Nation's booth. Dan DiDio puts on the big screen advertising 5G, which is a huge continuity shift in the DC universe. And now it's pretty much, we now know that what Dan DiDio was doing as the editor, as really he's the publisher, but what he was really doing is, that was like he was doing the equivalent of selling condo units before they even laid the foundation. It was, and nothing was set in stone. Clearly, he didn't even have Scott Snyder on board. He didn't even have most of the players on board for that change. I mean, you want to talk about continuity. I mean, one of the things is don't tell your writers about continuity unless all your writers are on board. I mean, you need creatives on board. You need your creative team on board for a continuity change before you start shooting your mouth off. Because I think that I think you have to be very careful with continuity, that don't play your hand. Like, you can let the story come out first before you play your hand, because that way you have more flexibility. If you create false expectation, and let the story evolve itself. How many examples do we both know of where good stories came out and people weren't even expecting it to create its own universe? I mean, look at the Murphyverse. I mean, nobody thought that he'd get his own universe, but he was. Good stories create their own continuity, and the fans decide what's going to happen, just like the fans decide on the Snyder Cut. Good stories will create their own continuity simply by popularity, and DC has got to let their best stories sort of rise to the surface. Look at all the Elseworlds tales. Some of the Elseworlds tales got their own Earth in the 52 Earth multiverse. I mean, sometimes you got to let the fans decide. And I think that's one of the things that corporations that own these powerful licensed characters, I think they're discovering more and more the power of the fan base. Listen to your fans. Listen to the spec market in comic books. Listen to us guys on YouTube, what we're excited about, what we're talking about. We will give you our loyalty. We will give you our money. Take my money, but tell me this kind of story,
Yeah. The thing is, and the thing that you make a point is that 9 times out of 10, good story will eventually sell. If you give them the proper legs or the proper table, whatever the proper ground to stand on, good stories will eventually sell. Unfortunately, good stories don't always sell. I mean, we've seen it before. Hawkman is plummeting and has not really ever sold well, and it's been a pretty consistent title for DC. Even Curse of the White Knight by Murphy, you bring that up. It didn't sell overly well for some odd reason, and it was a good story. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's as good as the original series, but it was still excellent. So there's something to be said with those things and what they're marketing and how they're choosing to market, right? Like, who are we exposing to these books, and what books are we exposing to them? Obviously that's beyond me. That's a marketing thing. You'd think that you hire fucking professionals to work for a multi-billion-dollar company and do your marketing. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe that's just my own ignorance. But sorry, I know I'm definitely very pessimistic today. I'm feeling really ranty. But nonetheless, I think my statement stands. The issue is that, and we've used this analogy before, is that the comic book industry is one big machine. One simple malfunction with a cog or a gear or whatever, a hinge, whatever you want to use as an analogy, can really screw up the effectiveness of the machine. There's a huge issue with not keeping people accountable. And nine times out of 10, when they're trying to keep somebody accountable, they're being way too withholding, right? There's not really a consistent barometer for, okay, we can trust this creator to go out and know what they're doing and know that whatever they're going to do is going to be adding to the continuity into this universe, to these characters, to the mythos of these essential American gods, right? That's a very rare instance. You get the Jeff Johns, and even then it's very clear that there was some sort of issue on the publishing end with Doomsday Clock, because I don't care what anybody says, there's absolutely no way it took Gary Frank 3 years to draw that book in its original. I know he's slow, but there is no way that book took 3 years.
Yeah,
there was an issue. Things were changed. Clearly, the industry isn't transparent, so we're sitting here blaming Jeff Johns, who had the script done literally 3 years ago. And that's one of the biggest things, is that the big two in particular can maintain deniability because fans' tendencies are to blame the creators, because they are the mouthpiece, they are the face of the book. And there's like this weird dynamic where, depending on wherever you're sitting at as a retailer, as a fan, as an aspiring creator, you're going to blame different people for the same problem. And the lack of transparency is a huge issue. Nobody takes responsibility for their own flaws. And another a little rant. One of my biggest issues with this lack of transparency is that creators are so willing to get on their knees for their peers, no matter how bad it is. And I immensely respect those who are openly able to go out and say, this wasn't my best work. And maybe they won't sit there and say Bendis' Superman is trash, but they're also not going to go out of their way to say this is great, right? Because we've seen it. We've seen people openly praise garbage.
Yeah, you've made a few comments on Twitter to that effect, and I agree with you that I like when a writer displays some self-awareness of their flaws and of their difficulties. J. Willow Wilson did that with Wonder Woman in that interview. I know you made you alluded to that a number of times. It was very obvious that she was having problems with Wonder Woman. It showed. It wasn't a particularly good run. I was highly critical of it, but I knew what I believe I know what she was trying to do, but it didn't work. And she strongly implied that she had problems with it. Same with there's another writer that was Brian Hill has openly admitted that since he's more accustomed to writing screenplays, that's one of the reasons why he confesses to some over decompression with his Batman and the Outsiders. He says that's one of the things that he was working on. He admitted that to Weird Science DC, which, check out Weird Science DC podcast. It's a great podcast, guys, and check out the reviews. I review Legion of Superheroes on the site. Check it out. But again, that's what writers need to do. I love when writers admit the struggles and difficulties they have, because I'm more likely to read their work because I have a better appreciation of the work when it does really hit with me. What I don't like is when a writer defends their work by insulting the fans.
Yeah.
You should always defend your work. You can defend your point of view, but don't insult a fan by doing so. That's the one thing where, and I know it can be difficult in this day and age with Twitter and jerks as presidents, but you got to mind your tone. You got to act like an adult, even if world leaders don't.
I agree. There are some writers and artists that I respect immensely that will praise their peers no matter how bad it is. And really what spawns this was plug for a channel that doesn't need a plug from me. Comic Pop did an interview with Jim Zub, and Jim Zub even went as far as critiquing some of his peers' work and saying this wasn't their best stuff. There were some pacing issues. There were some characterization issues. And he was a little bit more harsh on his own shortcomings. But in a world where, I'll be specific. Scott Snyder is praising Bendis' Superman or Tom King's Batman because he wants to be pals with everybody. I respect the shit out of Jim Zub, and simply the honesty and the integrity to come out here and know when he was off his game, and to know and openly admit when his peers were off their game is such a fresh breath of air that I don't even read much Jim Zub, and it makes me want to read Jim Zub because at least this guy is actively learning from his mistakes. You brought up the G. Willow Wilson statement that she gave in an interview with Sci-Fi Wire. I have immense respect for that, because if a creator doesn't know where they're going wrong, they won't grow. Like, that's the number. That is the I am an amateur creative. And the one central lesson that I've learned from anybody who has been worth their salt that has given me advice says, find a good editor, listen to a good editor, adapt, change, grow. That's what being a storyteller is about. At least if you're going to continue doing it over a long period of time. It's what it is at anything. If you want to do anything, you as a lawyer, you had to learn how to push a better argument. You had to learn how to shape the narrative of the situation in a way that makes whoever your opposition is look like a fucking idiot and come out on top. It's quite simply. You know what I mean? You have to grow and change and adapt. As I've done this YouTube channel, I've had to learn not to be flat. I've had to learn to explain myself a little bit more. Like,
yeah, the writer of Wonder Woman Dead Earth, I think his name is it Dwayne
Daniel Warren Johnson.
Daniel Warren Johnson, thank you. He just recently gave an interview, and he stated that when he made a big name for himself by writing Extremity. He had a number of successful indie titles with Image. Mm-hmm. One of them was Extremity, and DC offered him. DC said to him, "You can." They offered him any member of the Trinity, and they approached him and they said, "You can write Superman, Batman. What do you got?" And his editor, his editor asked him, "Well, give me an idea for Batman. Give me an idea for Superman." And I forget what he said his ideas for Batman and Superman were, but the editor thought they were terrible ideas, and he admitted he didn't really have an idea, and of all the things he found himself attracted to a story for Wonder Woman that seemed to work, and that's the one he's writing. And it's just what you never know where you get your inspiration from. But it was interesting listening to him because when I read his Extremity series, and you couldn't get more different. It's a very different type of story when you go from Extremity to his Wonder Woman. And it was interesting. It was interesting just how he talks about process and where he draws his inspiration from. And you have to feel it. You have to have a story you need to tell, or you're going to be lost.
Yeah. And the thing about the creative process is there's obviously a level of confidence that you want to have, right, in order to pull off some of the things that you're going to need to pull off. And you will miss certain strokes. There are always things that you will try as a writer that you either didn't develop properly or that you're just not ready to do. But you have to acknowledge those things and grow from them and learn how to pull off the tips and the techniques that you weren't able to do before. When you had I don't know what video it was in particular where you went into depth about a conversation you had with Scott Snyder and his justification. He was polite about it. He was very, very polite. He's a very cordial guy, very civil. I have a lot of respect for him in the way that he talks to and treats his fans. But there was also still an element of the defense just felt very dry to me. It felt like he didn't really have a leg to stand on, and that he was actively trying to convince himself. You know what I mean? It didn't feel like he had convinced himself that his argument and that his kind of rationale for doing what he did in Justice League was actually why he did it. And that's kind of where I take a little bit of an issue. There comes a point of like delusion. And I think that every good artist at their best will always have a little bit of paranoia behind them. It is the thing that keeps them crossing their T's and dotting their I's. And there's obviously a balance to be had, right? Like, you don't want to be immensely self-deprecating. You want to have a level of confidence enough to put your best foot forward and to try to pull off things that are going to ultimately bolster the execution of your overall product. But you also need to have a firm understanding of where you need to grow. And if you can't acknowledge those things, that's when you hit a plateau. Or that's when you start to plummet down. I mean, we said, I think on our last stream, that there's this uncanny thing going on right now where the superstar writer's time in the sky is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. The burnout is happening within 2 to 3 years versus 10 years. What's going on? I mean, we couldn't possibly know. Maybe it's just on an individual basis. Maybe it's just those writers. But there's something to be said about that. Is that there's this overconfidence, I think, going on where they get to a certain point and they think they're either untouchable or they're satisfied. And to me, a real artist is never satisfied.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm not. You make a comment that I'm not sure I agree with, but maybe you could convince me, because I've not really thought about it like that before, about there being a burnout for writers, about them having a 2 or 3 year run and then they're done. I mean, certainly when I look at Bendis and Dan Slott and Rick Remender, and I mean, I'm looking at some of these writers. They've had good 10-year runs. I mean, they've really slowly built up their careers. I mean, Donny Cates, I think, is definitely in the high point. He's at 3 years already, arguably 4 or 5 even. So I'm not really sure if I think that there's I don't think there necessarily has to be a burnout. But I do note that I do think that ego has a lot, certainly comes into play here. And the other reality is, let's just put this on the table. I think a lot of comic book writers, comic books are a stepping stone to something greater. And, Rick Remender gave a fantastic interview, and he made fun of Marvel fans a little bit, and in a fun way, not a bad way. But Rick Remender doesn't tolerate fools, and he remembers writing Scarlet Witch and wanting to defend himself, saying, guys, I have to do this, I was told this, and and dealing with continuity buffs. And he talked about the frustrations of writing stories where he knew that this would ruffle feathers and that, and what he had to twist and turn, and it was a very, very good interview. But one thing he loves, he says you just can't compare it to doing your own stuff, his own creative works. He likes it infinitely better. I mean, it's more rewarding. He's working on his own screenplays. He's got like 3 or 4 things with TV studios on the go now, all which flowed from his comic book career. He talked about his frustrations and his struggles working Comic-Cons, and he, over 25 years, he really built his career up, and he paid his dues, and a lot of paying your dues, as I understood it from him, was that when you're working with characters that aren't your own, the continuity thing can be very, very challenging, and that adds an extra bit of pressure trying to please fans like old school jerks like me that drink Corona while I read my comic book and then complain that something's out of whack. I mean, I myself possess enough self-awareness to know that I can be pretty hard on writers, but hey, that's why they get paid the big bucks.
I agree, but I think that there's just also this awareness that those creators have where they're willing to put themselves in a situation where they walk away from the big two with the demand still there. Like, then you have other writers who burn themselves out, and it gets to a point where you never want to see them again, right? Like, we still want to see Ed Brubaker one day come back to some big two stuff. You want to know why? Because he went out doing good work. He
went out high. Yeah, he went out on a high note.
Look at Greg Rucka. I don't know how long it was before he came back to DC. You want to know why everybody was so cool with him coming back? Because he went out on a high bar. Same with Hickman. Hickman went away for a couple of years and did his Image stuff. Came back. People wanted it. That's the issue. Is that first of all, these creators aren't self-aware enough to figure out when they're starting to burn out. But I do absolutely believe that the burnout period is getting smaller and smaller. I mean, look at Williamson. Williamson's first nail biter was fine. I'll even venture to say the first 2 or 3 arcs of his Flash were fine. And then mediocrity. Tom King, not consistent at all. Yeah. He'll have great project, bad project, great project. So, I mean, even Snyder has written one of my favorite Batman runs of all time. I'll sing its praises until I die. But you look at his consistency. He has never amounted to the work that he did within the 3 to 5 years that he did, that he started American Vampire, went to Detective Comics, did Witches, and his Batman run. Since he has left his Batman run, he has not come close to the quality that he had before. And I say that as somebody who desperately wanted him to keep one-upping himself. I thought his Justice League was going to be his magnum opus. And it wasn't. He peaked at Batman. Or, if you want to bring up his independent stuff. But again, that's all within that 5-ish year window. Yeah. There's certainly no longevity to that, right? Like, the burnout's there. So I'm certainly starting to see it more and more. And I think ego is certainly, the egos are apparent. That is a big part of it. They become too comfortable in what they're doing, or they become too satisfied. And like I said, the best artists are never truly satisfied. And whether or not they're creating things that you personally enjoy, 9 times out of 10, I feel like we can at least acknowledge that they're giving it their all, right? Grant Morrison's Green Lantern run right now is super divisive, but he's doing what he truly thinks is the right thing to do with the character. I admire that. The book I started liking, somewhere in the middle, stopped liking. But you know what? I know that he's doing what he thinks is right for the character, and he's putting his best foot forward, even though I don't like it. So there's something to be said about that, where I can make that acknowledgement and look at writers who I've also loved, like Snyder, like Williamson, and even King in some ways, and see burnout. It's rampant. I mean, Bendis at least had like a good decade of solid storytelling, and then mediocrity was on its way. But there's a lot of issues with that, and that's almost a conversation in of itself. Nerd Scum kind of reiterates a lot of my comments here, saying that growth as an artist is always important. When you stop growing, you hit stagnation, like what we're seeing in Bendis, and it's very true. And he gives his personal experience here, that as a screenwriter, he has scripts that he's been working on for a decade. And every time he finishes the draft, he realizes he's not the right writer to do that story yet. And it's that awareness that allows you to continue to grow, because you start to try to acquire the skills to pull off the things that you want to pull off. It's very simple. I don't know. And again, I'm not an amateur. I mean, I'm not a professional. I haven't made money, or I haven't made crazy money doing this yet. But I feel like these are very simple, fundamental things that these people are forgetting. These are the things that, like I said, any creative that has given me advice that is worth their salt has said, these are the things that you need to maintain no matter what. And clearly these people are not maintaining those things.
Well, interestingly enough, speaking of Bendis, I mean, he did indicate in an interview that has since been removed on the off panel podcast site. Bendis did indicate that he's leaving. He's going to be off Superman.
God bless.
And they removed that. No, but they removed that. Now the guy that removed it, the guy that interviewed him, forget his name. He claims that's not the reason he removed the interview. He said he removed the interview because the interview was too happy. It was too happy of a mood in these particular times, because it came out over the weekend during the riots. And I thought, well, what a stupid reason to remove an interview, because it's a happy interview. Bendis is always happy. He's always taking happy pills. I mean, Bendis is always, Bendis, to his credit, is always respectful, and he's always giving, he's always respectful of the interviewers. And, I mean, I don't have, he's a nice person. He's a very fine, nice human being. He's a father, loving person. And he, and all that jazz. But in any event, I like to think that maybe Bendis realizes that Superman is not a title that, he's, it's one of those things where, well, like Nerd Scum said there, Nerd Scum has ideas for a screenplay that he realizes other writers might be more beholden, more better to write at this time. Mm-hmm. Bendis has good ideas that I think he should leave other writers to explore, because Bendis doesn't know how to get the most out of the ideas. In my mind.
I don't think Bendis has the integrity to do that. I don't give him that much credit, just by virtue of how much bad he's done in such a limited span of time at DC Comics. I'm not going to really begin to speculate as to why he's off Superman, but if it is true, all I can do is be happy about it. And this is kind of what comes down to the conversation. And this does ultimately kind of wrap into the conversation of creativity versus continuity, right? Because when creativity goes completely unopposed, it doesn't have a canvas. You can't take a paint and a paintbrush and splatter paint throughout the air. You're not going to get anything. There needs to be a canvas. There needs to be a boundary that you are set to work in so that you can do what you do best. And when that boundary is not given, the story is sacrificed. And, we've talked about the kind of business side, but aside from making money, I think the first priority should be the quality of the story. But perhaps to them that's secondary, and it's evident. But even if your second priority is telling good stories, I feel like there are just very simple confines and boundaries that you need to lay out to give the creators the room they need to breathe. We did 2 sister videos that you can find between our channels where we drafted creators from Marvel to DC and from DC to Marvel. And you and I both have kind of been on a particular bender about how poor DC has been in their mainline continuity the last 2 years. But the one thing that the stream made us realize was how talented some of the people at DC, an overwhelming amount of creators at DC are. But they're not given the sandbox that they need to play in order to succeed. And sometimes telling even the best creatives no is a really, really helpful, productive way to shape their vision into the best thing possible. And that's why good editors are important. When you look at all of the huge books that came out of Vertigo, the one consistent thing that every single one of those writers and artists credit is Karen Berger. I have never come across an interview where any of them talk about their Vertigo work without praising Karen Berger. You want to know why? Because she was a talented editor who knew what her creators could do. She knew what canvas to give them in order to let them succeed, and she knew when to say no. I mean, can you believe that she said no to Neil Gaiman's first draft of Sandman? And if she didn't, God forbid we got something that wasn't as legendary as it was. That's important. Having the judgment to be able to say no is just as important as saying yes. And clearly it's not that present right now.
Yeah. You know, I think that sometimes I have a very conservative view of art in general. And to give you an example, I'm talking like modern day art, like painted art. There is the modern day artists nowadays, and I'm talking about like the canvas and the outside of comic books. Most artists are absolutely terrible. They're the Jackson Pollock. I mean, there are idiots out there that will puke on a piece of paper and they'll call it art. And there's some idiot out there that'll pay $100,000 for it. Modern day versions of what defines art in this millennial age, I think, as talented as some of them are, the vast majority are absolutely, completely talentless hacks. And I think, unfortunately, in this day and age where everybody wants to be special, and in an age of microaggressions and everyone gets offended so easily, and nobody's got the balls to tell somebody that they have no talent because you might offend them or give them a seizure. The fact of the matter is that there's an enormous amount of truly untalented people out there, and that's filtered into aspects of the comic book industry, to be very blunt about it. And I think the bar in many ways has been lowered and lowered. And it's pretty sad that, and I've made this point before, that, you know, it's pretty bad when we look at our evergreen products for DC, we still have to point to Watchmen, which is 35 years old. I mean, there should be better quality stories and more of them more of the time. Because like you said, like you and I have talked, DC has the talent, but you gotta build that canvas, that background, the environment upon which these characters live, that these creatives can tell the stories within. And, you know, rather than, you know, it's not unforeseeable to have a great Grant Morrison Green Lantern story and a great Doomsday Clock and a great Death Metal. Theoretically, I suppose they could be stories in and of themselves. They don't necessarily have to form part of one cohesive universe. But when you kind of are trying to do that, or you're given the, you know, you're always, DC's got to make up its mind. You have to decide. I think of the scales of justice. You know, justice is blind. And when I compare that to stories, if Lady Justice is a storyteller and she should be blind to the audience, meaning that she shouldn't write to any particular audience, that no matter who reads the story, if that story is written well, it shouldn't matter if you know anything about continuity or creativity or character or nothing. The story will resonate with you. You know, a good story will appeal to everybody. And those are what the best do. So not only is justice blind, but good writing is blind too. And, it's maintaining that balance that is so difficult. But you know what? DC and Marvel and Valiant and all those comic companies, they got to rise to the challenge, man. They got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it is all about balance, and the conversation isn't creativity versus continuity, really, even though that's what I put on the thumbnail, because that just, let's be real. In the words of Todd McFarlane, it's sexy. It is a conversation of creativity and continuity. The best stories balance the two. And the best stories that break continuity are the ones that are fully aware that there isn't a continuity to break. That's why Elseworld stories work. That's why we can enjoy Batman Damned, even though it kind of contradicts aspects of the character in the mythos many ways. But they're given a canvas that allows them to form their own continuity. They're not trying to do that in continuity, cough, cough, Tom King. And that's what makes it work. There's always a balance in that conversation as to the ability of the editorial to reel in the creativity of the creators and concentrate it into the best thing it can be, with the canvas being the continuity, is important. Those two things need to be in harmony, right? It's a yin and a yang, 100%. And when that balance isn't there, the quality of the storytelling depreciates and it's not as present. You made an excellent comment about the lack of evergreen stories right now. Why?
Yeah.
The talent's there. Comic book art, the art is better than it has ever been. Right? There's so much out there. There's a lot of talent. And the issue is that we're not focusing on editorial. And we're not putting the people in there that are able to shepherd the visions of these creators. They're either way too hands-off or way too hands-on. And the editors, the few and the far in between that are excellent at what they do, are unfortunately in many ways taken advantage of or not fully appreciated. It was a damn shame that DC let Karen Berger go to Dark Horse. That was a mistake. Probably one of the biggest mistakes that they've made in the last 20 years, if you ask me. And even Peter Tomasi, he probably got frustrated with the state of editorial, and that's why he switched to writing. And we're very fortunate that he's a talented writer. He's excellent. He's one of the best that DC has right now. But there's something has to be said about how there must have been an apparent dissatisfaction with being an editorial that drove him to write. He was probably unsatisfied with the boundaries that the upper editorial were giving him, what they were allowing him to do, say, because we've seen it presently that big names overwrite editorial, which at that rate, why are you wasting editorial brain power? If you're going to do it, then put the editor on something that they're going to edit.
Well, and one thing about if you have worked with DC or Marvel and they tell you and they allow you to write a story that's out of continuity, the advantage of that is that sometimes you can avoid controversy, because you can avoid getting reprimanded for being out of continuity from fanboys like us. For example, let me use Brian Azzarello's Birds of Prey that came out this month. He had a scene in there, it was very subtle, where Black Canary, actually, it implied that she said that I really enjoyed those three bros. She basically picked up three guys at a bar and had sex with them. Dinah Lance, Black Canary, had sex with three guys that she picked up at a bar in the same night, and then celebrated the next day by enjoying a hot sauna with Harley Quinn and the Huntress. I mean, Azzarello, the same guy that the creator of Batwang, Azzarello, wrote that scene, and guess what? It's not in this Birds of Prey is not in continuity. This should have been the movie. This is an excellent, fun, action-packed read, and personally, I think it's another example of, I love the story so much, I personally would love to see a Birds of Prey series based on that continuity, on Azzarello's state of mind. if I could encapsulate Azzarello's state of mind for that Birds of Prey environment, for that continuity, I would want a continuity set. I would love to see the DC superhero set in Azzarello's Birds of Prey universe. And that's an example of an Elseworlds tale, if you will, or Black Label series that I think really works. And I think that the reason why Black Label for DC is working, and I'll ask you this, or maybe I'll ask this as a question, and that is, I think that Black Label for DC is going to work and become even more successful because it's the out of continuity stories it's because the stories are out of continuity that will make them more appealable to readers and more accessible and arguably more successful, and might even lead to further universes. Do you agree?
No, because first of all, and just in terms of success, I mean, success is relative. So we might have different definitions of success. For me, my kind of metric is it going to be as successful as it could have been? And with the huge issue that they had with clearly having no idea what they wanted Black Label to be, and then floundering around for about a year until they figured out what they wanted it to be now, they lost a huge body of people that were interested in the label. There were people, and I guarantee you, myself included, who would have been buying books that they normally would not have bought because the marketing for Black Label in its inception was genius. It was so good that it made me interested in buying things I would have been interested in. So will we get good stories? Will we be successful in the sense that we're going to be getting some great stories from creators that are given a landscape that works for them? Absolutely, yes, we've seen it, and we are seeing it right now. In terms of the appeal of DC Black Label, I genuinely believe that whatever it amounts to will be nowhere near what it could have been if they hadn't floundered around for over a year. I mean, we literally did a video like a year ago of where DC Black Label was a year after the announcement, and all they had was a couple of Batman books. And like Superman Year One at the time was on the horizon. And even now, to me, the best stories to come out of Black Label are, or at least the best concepts are, letting Joe Hill have a horror line of comics, letting Philip Kennedy Johnson do a big fantasy epic. Like we're giving those stories spaces that they wouldn't normally get from the big two. And then obviously most everything Jeff Lemire has done for Black Label has been great. The big, huge stories that they pushed in the marketing, largely I haven't given a shit about, right? Like Superman Year One was trash. Last Night on Earth was a disappointment. Half of the other stuff that they solicited isn't even coming out. I was so interested in John Ridley's Other History of the DC Universe, and clearly it would have had a very prevalent societal impact right now. Why don't we have it? Why is there no announcement for that?
Well, I think that can fall at the hands of editorial. In terms of the actual quality of the stories themselves, I think the vast majority of the Black Label series have been very good stories. I wasn't a huge fan of Superman Year One, but I pretty much enjoyed everything else. Like I really like the Joe Hill stories. I think overall, like I'm enjoying the Black Label line, and I think my point where I'm coming from is I really like the stories. They're easy to follow. They're creating their own continuity, so you don't need to know any old continuity to enjoy any of the stories. You don't need to know anything about Harley Quinn to enjoy any of the Harley Quinn Black Label stories / Joker related. I think it is. I think the point of Black Label, or at least one of the attractive features of Black Label, is not only is it more adult, catered to older readers, but you really don't need to have a affiliation or knowledge of the characters themselves to really appreciate the storytelling. I mean, if you don't like the story, that's one thing, but if you're going to not like the story of a Black Label, what's come out so far, it's not going to be because you don't understand what's going on. you can, it'll be for other reasons that you're just not interested in the story, or it's, badly written or whatever. But, well, I mean, I guess the jury's still out. I mean, we'll have to wait and see, because with this pandemic hit, this pandemic really took the momentum out of a lot of creative endeavors of all the comic publishers. So hopefully we'll see some movement now, well, moving into the future here.
The big thing for me is I hope that just DC, their editorial, their publishing department, just figures out what they want Black Label to be. Like I said, I commend the Joe Hill line. I commend what they're allowing Philip Kennedy Johnson, I think is his last name.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. To do on Last God. Those are great moves. Those are giving genre stories an opportunity to get the exposure from the second biggest comic book publisher in the world. I just hope that whatever they do with it, I hope that they have a consensus on what that line means and what it's supposed to be. And the big issue is, again, that it I mean, clearly the launch of Black Label was an absolute disaster. Like, one of the biggest mistakes they made, for example, to me, and I know we've kind of disagreed on it, was not reprinting the first issue of Batman Damned. Whether or not there was a penis in there, it was a #1 of the first Batman Black Label series. That issue sold out in a day.
Oh, I agreed with you. They should have reprinted it. Yeah.
That was a huge mistake. Whether or not I mean, I personally don't agree with the censorship, but even regardless of that, that was a huge mistake. They lost so much money. That was an $8 book that I think that if they had continued to print, that book would have sold at least 250,000 copies. I mean, the controversy certainly helped sales. Like, whether or not they wanted to let that become the image for Black Label, the controversy would have sold the book.
There's no question that Brian Azzarello, and I'm speculating when I say this, but remember that Birds of Prey, Azzarello's Birds of Prey, was originally going to be a 3-issue series. Then it became 2. Then it became 1, and they're cramming 100 and whatever pages into one oversized Black Label. Wow. And Brian Azzarello was fairly vocal about how upset he was with the censorship on the first issue of Batman Damned. He was vocal about that. That guy has no problem saying the guy is. Most guys who interview Brian Azzarello, he doesn't give great interviews. He's fairly blunt and he's overly sarcastic, but I love the guy because he just doesn't give a shit. He doesn't care. He says it the way he feels it. But he's a creative genius. And, he's the one guy that I don't mind if a guy, look, nobody likes a smart ass, but I'm a smart ass at times. And, I'm more respectful of a smart ass if they can back it up and they're good at what they do. And so Azzarello's good at what he does. Virtually everything that guy's written, I have enjoyed. Literally everything from Loveless, which is a Western Vertigo series. He wrote 24 issues that nobody's read, to his Batman, what was that?
Broken City.
Thank you. Broken City, to his 100 Bullets, to good Lord, to his Wonder Woman run. It's my favorite incarnation of Wonder Woman. He actually had Wonder Woman call another woman a bitch, and he took slack from it, and he didn't care. I just love the guy. Good Lord. You don't see that type of courage now, and that it's pretty sad when that qualifies as courage nowadays, is just standing up for yourself. But thank God Azzarello does, because there's so many snowflakes that are writers in the independent market, and every writer out there, I hate when they apologize for things they shouldn't apologize for. They have a creative vision and then they get criticized, and then they back down and they apologize for their vision, and they want to, and they'll change the skin colors and the tones of the various characters because they're afraid they're going to offend somebody. It's like, look, if you got to stand for something or you fall for anything. And, it's not racist. It's not bigoted. It's called integrity. You either have it or you don't. And if you have it, you don't need anything else. And if you don't have it, it doesn't matter what else you do have.
Yeah. There's the issue is that we live in a world where cancel culture is so prevalent that people feel fear for their careers. And the thing that people are too stupid or too unwilling to acknowledge is the fact that capitalism is the system that lets you just not support the things you don't like. And if other people don't like them, they won't be supported. And guess what? They will stop. Cancel culture is like this unnecessarily explicit platform to destroy people. And I do agree. I do agree largely that I think that most things Brian Azzarello has written, I have liked. I'm not quite in the camp that I've enjoyed everything, but he's a very talented writer. I quite enjoy a lot of what I've read from him. And I admire the honesty and the bluntness and the integrity that he has in his stories. Because what can you fault the man for besides being totally unconcerned with the politics of it all? Yeah. You know, but when cancel culture arises, it deprives creators of the comfort that they deserve to tell the story that they want to tell. Because if it's bad, guess what? People won't buy it. People will, or they either won't buy it or they won't continue to support it. The numbers will fall off and the book will get canceled. That is the point of capitalism. That is literally the point. The market and the demand for the product controls the longevity of it. And if it's not there, it'll fail on its own. What is the point of pushing some stupid internet campaign? If you don't like it and other people feel the same way, it won't get very far. Yeah. It's that simple.
And this sort of leads into another issue is that I think if you do have a good story, if a good story comes out and it's creative and it that balance between creativity and continuity is there, or maybe it's brand new and you don't even need to worry about continuity, but you establish something new and great like Azzarello did with Birds of Prey, in my opinion. It's the other unknown force or the well-known force that can impinge on that is the pressures on the corporations and the cancel culture, which is exactly what we're talking about. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the indie writers, they like their Indiegogo campaigns, their Kickstarter campaigns, is that they have more creative freedom. And the reality is that it's upsetting to an awful lot of, certain people, very vocal people, when guess what? Azzarello's Birds of Prey is gonna, I hope, sell a lot of copies. It's gonna sell a lot of issues. It's beautifully illustrated by Manuela Lapacino. It's sexually provocative. It's action-packed. And I personally hope it pisses off a certain contingent on Twitter. I got into it to a few people on Twitter already on the subject matter. I don't understand the aversion that people have to tits and ass. It blows me away. I don't know why they have an aversion to attractive women, beautifully drawn by women. It's just, it astonishes me. And if you don't like the story, don't read it.
Yeah.
Don't read it. Because I just don't care if you're offended. I mean, I really genuinely don't care if you're offended. And this seems to shock people. It's like, look, if you're offended, well, okay, then you got to learn to deal with it. And if you really can't deal with it, it's called therapy. It's as simple as that. Go see a therapist. Deal with your issues, but don't get in my face about enjoying a comic book. Good grief.
Yeah, there's a serious issue when it comes to the kind of campaign to just really the cancel culture. It's disgusting. It pisses me off. Clearly, there are people that deserve to be canceled. There are disgusting people making art, doing things, saying things that are fucking horrible. But guess what? If enough people know what the creator is about and they don't support it, they won't buy it. And that creator will lose the opportunity to use the platform. It's very simple. It is the system that most Western economies are founded upon.
It's the marketplace of ideas. It's the marketplace of ideas, and the best ideas rise to the top and they sell. And the ones that aren't will be rejected and discarded. That's what capitalism is,
Yeah.
But when you forcibly hire people, not for their ideas, but for their gender or something else, it soon becomes apparent that they don't have good ideas. And so, I mean, that's sort of if you don't let that's why merit. I don't want to get sidetracked too much into that sort of political issue, but I mean, good ideas matter, and if you focus on good ideas, it doesn't matter, what the color of your skin is or your gender. I mean, you can be talented no matter what you look like or who you want to sleep with or whatever the case might be. Just have good ideas. And in any event, I'm out of Corona.
Tragic.
I'm out of ideas now. I don't have no alcohol. I can't think.
That is the most tragic ongoing of the whole conversation. I think the biggest issue is that representation is important, and who's getting to tell these stories is important, but ideas are the most important thing, and the execution is falling well within that range. And the biggest issue is when a lot of the diversity hires do happen, they're doing it because these are a very, very vocal body of people who push representation for representation's sake, rather than going out there into kind of the underground or the independent scene of creators who are talented, who do represent diverse bodies of people, who are better storytellers. They're just not vocally screaming at you and telling you that this needs to happen. We talk about all of these diversity hires. For example, Brian Hill, immensely talented writer, does not push his politics on anybody. Yeah. He very clearly incorporates the kind of racial struggle into his work. It's very present. You read American Carnage, it is all about our society and how disgusting it has become, but it's not heavy-handed. His intent to tell stories isn't to throw his identity politics in there. His identity politics are a part of the story, and they're a part of his experience, and that's important. The viewpoint is important. That perspective is important. Getting those stories out there are important. But the thing is that if you're telling a story for the sake of identity politics, then it's not a story. It's a political campaign. Yeah. When you tell a story through the lens of somebody who might not maintain the same lens or perspective as yourself, who has an idea, who lets their angle permeate the writing, that's when you get good story with diverse perspective. You know what I mean? And that's a concept that is, I feel, is lost.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, gave an interview with Ezra Klein, which was excellent. It's an hour and a half long, and I really liked it. He made a comment. He goes about Donald Trump, and I'm going to relate this to his run on Captain America. That I think one of the things that Nehisi Coates is trying to do with his Captain America run, and that I don't think it's really worked, but it's played out in real life. That is that when he makes the comment about with the riots and everything, he made the comment that for the first time he feels actually hope that there might be change. And he actually thinks that for the first time, the Black community in the United States actually feels that they have more people on their side, that people, because of Trump's actions and the riots are against all people, not just African Americans, that for once they feel that they have allies, and that for the first time, many other groups other than just Blacks can understand what a snapshot of what it's like to be African American because of what's happening in the last few months. Now, you can agree or disagree with what he said, but I thought it was very telling, especially in the context of what I think he was trying to accomplish, what he continues to try to accomplish in his Captain America run. And I think that's one of the things he's trying to convey is that struggle, but trying to relate it to the everyday reader, not just, African Americans. And so I thought that was very, very interesting. And I actually it was a very good interview. I came out of it with much more respect for him. It was the first time that he actually gave an interview where I actually felt that he wasn't talking out of his ass. Because he was always talking in obscure side notes. He never really, it was the first time he said something that actually resonated with me. And maybe it's because of these tumultuous times that are occurring, but he's actually, he did have an impact on me, and I'm gonna be looking at his Captain America run through a different lens now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak too much on politics, but I think that the general idea is that the diversity in perspective is important. It helps us to understand each other. But when these creators go out and the entire intent of the story is that perspective is to push their politics, the stories suffer. The reason, to me, the milestone characters work are because Dwayne McDuffie and Reginald Hudlin set up a universe that frames the Black experience. These stories conveyed an experience. They didn't tell a story for the sake of, for the sake of pushing the Black experience. They were telling stories that carried with them the Black experience. And that's why they were good. That's why people remember them, right? And nobody really discusses that. I find, especially right now, that we have a lot of creators and even editors out there who kind of they do get the diversity higher because they're the ones kind of screaming into the ether, and somebody unfortunately answers and says, okay, well, we'll put you on. Whereas I don't think I just don't think it's crazy to say that there's somebody who represents the same body of people that can convey that experience in a much more efficient and a much more plausible way that allows the story to work. I mean, that's my issue, is that I obviously diversity is very important to me. Perspective is very important to me. Understanding the angles that different people are approaching various aspects of life in are very important to me. But those things have to be a device to it has to be kind of the atmosphere of the narrative. It cannot be the whole narrative. It cannot be the whole plot. A lot of the people that are doing it now are, again, they were the ones that were just screaming, and they were like, okay, stop yelling. Like, we'll let you do it. Whereas, again, there's countless people with the ability to represent, various groups of people and do it well and tell a good story. And because they're not the ones screaming into the abyss about it, they're not the ones that are getting to tell those stories. But
yeah, Paul Baker, you put his comments up there. Not Azzarello is not for everybody. I mean, I respect that point of view. He's written a couple things that Azzarello has written. He wrote a series for Vertigo called Spaceman that I wasn't a huge fan of, but I mean, we all things are hit and miss. There's another comment by Paul Baker in the chat. Dark Knight, he says, in quotations, "Marketplace of ideas, my ass. We're just gonna forget how shitty the early '90s was for comics, even though it had everything you're praising?" ? I don't know. I wasn't a huge fan of comic books. There was a 3-year time span in the '90s where I didn't collect because I was in law school. I just collected Wonder Woman comics for about 3 years, but I wasn't a huge fan of comics in the '90s, to be honest with you. Although you have a good point that it had everything I'm praising. I guess it did. It did have a lot of. It did have a lot of ideas, but it did lead to a glut. It had a lot of tropes, and I think it had a lot of. I think it was an idea. I think that the '90s was a prime example of too much of everything in the '90s. That they were throwing shit at a wall in the '90s, and everything. I mean, people forget how terrible Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man was. How badly written that first issue was of Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. That's one of the worst comic books you will ever read in terms of structure, common sense, story. It was awful. It was beautiful art, but it was awful. The story was awful. I mean, most of the Image coming right out of the gate, the Image titles were terrible stories. I mean, they weren't well put together. I mean, it just wasn't, they weren't well structured at all. It was just, they were throwing crap at a wall. But I mean, it is what it is.
I mean, I think something too that's worth mentioning is that the early '90s was a big kind of evolutionary period for comics. Comics were starting to change, and our understanding of what they were starting to change. It was during the early '90s that we saw the creation of Vertigo, right? And it was very short after the phenomena that were Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and people were starting to understand that comics don't always have to be the gratuitous violence and the big muscles and all the like it can be more than what we might see at the surface, and it can be more than that. And I think the big issue is at the time is that the overwhelming consciousness of comic book fans still thought that that's all it could be, and the market got saturated with it. And there's also something to be said about the fact that comics, people were buying them, right? Like it was the consumer that was contributing to the tropes, to all of the early '90s garbage that gave them the kind of go ahead to continue producing garbage. I say it on a lot of streams. If you keep buying something you don't like, you don't have a right to complain at all, because that's like saying, that's like going to, obviously it's 2020, so this is kind of prevalent. That's like saying, I don't want X to be president, I'm still voting for X. That doesn't make any sense. So, it's not entirely on the industry in and of itself. The consumer market does some really weird things. Not to mention, a lot of people were buying because they thought that they were going to be able to put their kids through college. The speculator market helped, was kind of one of the biggest, had one of the biggest hands in the downfall of the comic book industry.
Yeah. To Paul Baker, it's all good, man. It's okay to sound, I don't know if you, I didn't think you sounded hostile. It's all good. Enjoy your Corona.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's your opinion, man. You're welcome to your opinion, and we're glad that you feel comfortable enough sharing it with us and leaving it open to conversation. That's what's important, man. Discourse is important. And whether or not we walk away agreeing, we can walk away agreeing to disagree. And when you pop into the next stream, I'm still going to smile and say, hey, Paul, man, thanks for sliding through. So don't apologize.
I'm going to have to, I've got to leave the stream now, Dark Knight. If we could just wrap it up in the next 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah. I'm feeling the same way. I'm kind of, I'm definitely tailing off. So I apologize for those watching, especially towards the end. I'm not all with it right now. So, but I do very much want to thank everybody for participating, watching, giving us their thoughts on everything going on, and providing to the and adding to the conversation. So big thank you to Joe's Geek Show, Jalen Neely, Skip and Tosh, Tevye Smoka, Paul Baker, Star Tiger, Jeff Schultz. I think that's pretty. Taylor Pector, Nerd Scum. I think I got everybody there, and obviously my cohort ComicBoom for sitting down and having this conversation with me. I apologize to everybody watching again. I know it got a little bit ranty. I know some of you like that. Some of you probably are not here for the rants, but sometimes we just need to get those things off our chest. So if you haven't already, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed. Go check out this guy over here. Link to his channel in the description below. ComicBoom, what do you have coming out for the good people and for their viewing pleasure?
What do I got coming up? I'll probably be reviewing Wonder Woman next. I think I just reviewed I can't even remember what I reviewed. I'll probably be doing I'll be reviewing Wonder Woman. I'm gonna probably be reviewing all of Joker Harley in one review, Criminal Sanity, the first 4 issues. And yeah, that's what I got. I'm not really pumping out a lot lately. I still have a God Country thing that I'm working on a review, but yeah. So yeah, I'm working a lot, so I don't have a lot of time to do reviews. So
hey, man, priorities, brother. I get it. I totally get it. Hence me taking 4 months off. You're speaking to the right person. But yeah, make sure you guys go check it out. He provides a very honest review in everything that he does, and his perspective is very unique. So if you guys want a good review, you want an honest review, you want to get a fundamental understanding of what the book is doing, you go check Comic Boom out, you subscribe, share his videos, get him to that big bad 1,000 subscriber mark because he deserves it. And if you happen to enjoy this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe down to me as well. I'm thinking that I might drop a review of the Black Label Birds of Prey issue. If that's something you guys would be interested in, feel free to let me know. But at the end of the day, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, whether you came live or are watching this video on demand. Thank you so much. And we'll catch you guys in the next episode of Let's Talk Comics on Dark Knight Nation. Have a good night, guys.
See you guys.